Okay. Hi. I think a lot of people haven't come back, but yeah, that's better for me. So, just to, okay, so the problem that, of course, I had at the beginning was, okay, what are my disciplines? But the other thing was that I actually said something about that I would speak about ephemera and law, which is kind of bizarre because I'm not actually a legal practitioner or a litigating lawyer, so that I'm always a little wary of claiming law. But what is interesting is that we haven't really talked about many legal issues, so perhaps that may not be a good path to go down. And usually by this point, we've talked about copyright, performers' rights, things like that, which would be interesting to address. But in this particular context, since that hasn't come up really, maybe some other time, some other place to talk about things like that. Um, so, just I think I'm going to do a little bit of somewhere between summarizing and ending with my own thoughts. And I think one of the intriguing things that one of the intriguing presentations was, I think Steve Lewis's, which was about what doesn't make it to the archive, which kind of is an illuminating question to ask in relation to ephemera. And again, I would rather than the definition provided in the morning by Alida was incredibly useful. I would rather not go down a definitional path, but also speak about in terms of properties or characteristics of ephemera. So in that context of those images of the posters, of the advertisements and all these markings on it and where they are and on street corners covered by cars, etc., it seemed like we're talking about objects where context overwhelms the viewing of the object, so it can't be removed or archived in any way that seems correct. And that might be, again, one of those properties or characteristics of ephemera that makes it particularly interesting. Another phrase that was used was where ephemera is an accidental finding by Toy. That to me signifies something about the mode of looking or the mode of finding ephemera or treating it as a research object that is interesting. And that it's not entirely about serendipity, but the fact that what we're looking at is actually so specific, and that is what we find so interesting about it. It is not general or generic. It is actually extremely specific, but yet in some ways it is not evidence, or yet in some ways it is not a research object with very clear contours as a research object or as an archival object. So in spite of that, there is some element of specificity that I think that intrigues us all. This lack of contours, these kind of contradictory characteristics, is the lack of contours especially is what Craig, I think, was pointing towards in terms of, and also the presentation on the Kanto earthquake yesterday, that a photograph can show you no more than you can see, but it cannot function as memory, and it is conveniently malleable as fiction. And all these things around objects that where their specificity is contrasted to, in some way, their fuzziness or their lack of specific outlines in a way. But one of the intriguing things, one of the presentations I found interesting yesterday was also Jennifer's. And she had a line that said, "Excuse me, I'm an assassin, and what is the way to the museum?" And which gestures towards finding unlikely objects or unlikely material in an archive, but also towards taking material and making it fuzzy because you think that it is going to do something for your research or for your archive as well. And also the fact that she said this thing about the hardest trace to find is corporeal experience, which kind of relates to my interest in the kind of the pirate print that I showed of the film, where there's this heavy interaction of the audience with the material. And that is precisely about this element of the bodily that you cannot necessarily find in the archive, or that you're trying to desperately reach through your research. And that perhaps is, in a sense, a characteristic of ephemera as well. I thought it would be interesting to talk about this idea of Agamben in terms of this definition that he has of gesture. And just to quote someone who's written about this, gesture for Agamben is what takes place when all definitive locations, life and art, text and execution, reality and virtuality, power and act, personal biography and impersonal event are suspended. In this opening, what appears or plays is gesture. According to Agamben, gesture is a special kind of action, neither a means nor an end. so this, I thought, in some ways related to the ways in which we were talking about ephemera in the last 2 to 3 days. And also kind of connects to me to the idea that our treatment of ephemera has to be lighter than our treatment of other research objects, which is why tools like perhaps representation or analysis, or perhaps tools within film studies or culture studies, may not necessarily be the best way to go forward here. There might be other ways in which one has to look at or study or relate to ephemera. And this particularly brings me to this concept that was explored in a work or in film studies on the relationship between the viewer and the film, but basically relying on phenomenology. And what is being spoken about is the relationship between the skin of the viewer and the skin of the film, and that there is a certain ephemeral, fleeting access that we have to certain kinds of material, and that it is about a kind of looking that lingers on the surface of the image rather than delving into depth, and is more concerned with texture than with deep space. This, to some extent, at least explains the pleasures of ephemera, in the sense of what is it that we find so completely compelling about it, that we have a fleeting, incomplete access to some material, that there's some opening left, that there is a frame in a found footage film that could be used in a murder mystery, that there is something completely, that there are spaces and possibilities around it. And these pleasures perhaps should not be obscured by putting them in an archive or putting them as part of our research. The last thing that I would like to talk about is perhaps not, again, I feel like I'm saying something that everybody knows already, and there is no need to actually overemphasize it, but there is a tendency that I have found within critical legal studies, which may be one of at least some discipline that I can have a claim to try and find the marginal, or to try and find the subaltern in like, so to speak, within legal material. So to give an analogy, it is a bit like the White Sargasso Sea and trying to have a voice for the mad woman in the attic that is ignored in Jane Eyre, etc. Or to try and find the subaltern figure, or try and find a voice from the margins. And something that we have come up again and again within the context of working in Padma is that whether an autonomous archive or any archive can automatically have this function, whether we can in fact have a certain kind of politics of redemption necessarily. And this is a difficult question to ask, because it affects our motivations for why we are part of this exercise of archiving. We are here to give voice to people who were victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy, part of the Gujarat riots, victims of an earthquake, disappearing classical arts and dance forms. All these various things that we think that we are actually, I mean, there is a certain political motivation with which we come to the activity of archiving, which cannot necessarily be put away. And that there is a hope that the engagement with residual within the archive would lead to a kind of transformative politics. But perhaps this is a caution sign that we need to put around the question of ephemera and margins, and that this is not necessarily true. Quite often ephemera can be a layer on existing material which does not necessarily come from the margins. And a different frame has to be found to determine and understand ephemera as that which is a fragment, and not necessarily revealing or telling of other narratives or even contradictory narratives, but perhaps layering on existing narratives, or perhaps performing an altogether different role. So one of the ideas that we have often come up with is, and it has been talked about a few times over the last 2-3 days, is this idea of the montage. And it is, in some sense, what I would like to call a trashy postmodern technique, perhaps. But nonetheless, it is perhaps been trashed as that. But it is actually an interesting mode. It is the ability to hold multiple things in place together, which is what a researcher has to do. And as Moinak pointed out, our fruit table outside is called fruit montage. So that's not a good sign. But perhaps we can find some gleanings from the idea of montage, and try to not be trashy in the way that we think about it. And there's actually a piece of footage that I wanted to show, but perhaps that I would do later. But basically, it is this footage from a filmmaker called Artavaz Pelician, of these sheep that are being taken down by herders down the side of a mountain. And basically, the mountain is almost vertical, and there's no way to go down the mountain except by the man hugging the sheep and falling down almost a vertical slope. So it's this incredibly beautiful footage that goes on and on and on. And what is interesting about Peletian's films are that they are montages, but they are pulled together in a particularly interesting, poetic almost way. And that there is a sense that he is using montage as a technique, but in very different ways from other people. In fact, of his technique, he says, which he calls distance montage, he says it creates a magnetic field around the film. Sometimes I don't call my method montage. I'm involved in the process of creating unity. In a sense, I've eliminated montage. By creating the film through montage, I have destroyed montage. In the totality, in the wholeness of one of my films, there is no montage, no collision. So a result is that montage has been destroyed. In Eisenstein, every element means something. For me, the individual fragments don't mean anything anymore. Only the whole film has meaning. I'm not necessarily comfortable with what he is saying about montage as well. There is a certain way in his films are about spirituality, but in that particular piece of footage, it is interesting that that it is not a godlike view, but that you almost feel like another person parallel to this person falling down a slope. But what I find interesting is that this idea of montage, especially if we are to be invested in it or invested in the idea of holding multiple research objects in a space, stuff that is ephemera, stuff that is not ephemera, which has to be held together, that we have to think about and perhaps theorize further on this idea of the montage and push it forward. And yeah, that's about it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm here in a kind of a peculiar position here. Unlike everyone who's spoken in the conference, I do not work with an archive or has ever thought of ephemera and archive as central to my work. But then there is a question that actually Tani posed on a different occasion when we had a lecture series on transnationalism, which I was part of. And there was a series of questions she started with. One of them was, why don't you use the term transnationalism in your research? And I think after that, that question has been very interesting for me. Why don't you use something in your research? And that, I think, is an interesting optic to look at your own practice in very interesting ways. So what I probably am doing is to go back to something that I did and think in these terms and see why didn't I call my work archival or ephemera? Why was not that part of my thing? So I'll just read some stuff. One of the tendencies that was most visible in the discussions over the last 2 days and in the morning today was pointed out by Anne yesterday, the simultaneous need to define ephemera narrowly and the desire to keep the category as open as possible. This issue has come up both as a theoretical concern and as a practical concern. But then there are also pulls to archive everything and also to ephemeralize everything. And there are two. And I'm using these terms when I'm writing ephemeralize, de-ephemeralize. So I'll use these things. I don't even know they're correct. But I think that the workshop would leave us with these impulses to be mapped onto our disciplinary institutional frameworks and settings. That's where I think it will go. Among all this, one of the most enduring modes of thinking about ephemera has been in the negative. Tani in her note talked about the constitutive double bind of ephemera. Once ephemera is defined and placed vis-a-vis other materials in formal or informal contexts, it ceases to be ephemeral. The negative definition is run through the workshop. From the housewife in the supermarket, from desertu, to the abandoned factory, to the mundane everyday objects, to footage, all the way to the number of camels. There is always a structure of visibility of sorts that allows for the simultaneous disappearance and availability of ephemera. At one level, there is a hierarchy. When I was fretting about this hierarchy in a personal conversation yesterday, Manan effectively resolved the problem for me by asking, why this desire for false equivalences? Why is this democracy among objects? This takes me to another place where the idea of ephemera seems to reside in comfort. We have been more or less talking about objects. We did talk about emotions and feelings, but more or less assumed that to get at these ephemeral categories of affect, we will more or less take the route of studying ephemeral objects. Jim Javier's presentation was an exception on this count. I will come back to it in a minute. This emphasis on objects as ephemeral necessitates that there is a hierarchy and that the definition question will be in constant deferral. In 2001, I started my doctoral research with a mission to capture the relationship between masculinity and public domain in a region within India. For students like me, whose parent discipline was English, and then moved to an interdisciplinary field that allowed for these kind of subjects, its kind of projects, it was indeed the encounter with materials and lives that are ephemeral that allowed for the broadening of our scholarly horizons. We were products of a disciplinary churning that was named then the crisis of English studies debate in India, which could be dated to the 1990s. I will not go into the details of that, but that's what it's called. But then, what are the ways of researching the present? This was the question that we kind of worked with. I mean, there's some idea that we should research the contemporary. That was the kind of, and what is this thing called the contemporary, right? What is the present? Are there archives for the present? How does one even start to understand the fleeting temporality of the present, ephemera par excellence? For whatever it's worth, I zeroed in on an incident as a placeholder for my research. This was the case of a sexual harassment of a non-teaching employee in a prominent university in the region. The precarious and the fleeting nature of the present was immediately obvious. As the developments around the incident unfolded, various kinds of archives were already being produced. On the one level, there was a legal archive. The woman who was sexually violated by a man in a public bus had filed a police complaint against him. A week or so later, she filed another complaint with the university against a colleague who, she argued, had initiated a gossip campaign against her on the campus. The archive was taking shape. The media also took great interest in the incident as the woman involved was a known feminist and environmental activist, and more importantly, because the man who was accused of starting the gossip campaign was a member of the very powerful trade union on the university campus affiliated to the Communist Party. So here was two sets of archives that was developing as the events are unfolding. There's no way you can escape this. There were clear directions for these archives. One founded within the rational modern structure of the law, geared towards evidence and punishment, and the other structured by ideologies, political and market-related, that governed the interest of the media. The question of ephemera was central to the legal battle. What does one do with gossip? It had surely left traces in anonymous posters that had appeared on campus, but the victim insisted on pinning down the point of origin of gossip, her colleague. He obviously argued that he was just repeating what he had heard elsewhere. I mean, that's how gossip works, right? I mean, who will say I started the gossip? Nobody. The law clearly was being put to test by ephemera. One thing I want to stress here, that rather than what was the gossip, which could be ascertained from other ephemeral evidence such as amateur wall posters, like what Steve told us, it was gossip as a form that was at issue. So it was not what the gossip was, what the story was, but the form of gossip that was at issue here. The rationalizing structure of the law cannot account for an ephemeral form such as gossip. This formal aspect of ephemera is something I would like to stress here. What happened with the case, I mean, again, a different question which we might or might want to talk about later, but it has implications on gossip as a problem. Unhappy with this archive that is being produced, the researcher's impulse is to produce one. The desire here to arrest another possible ephemeral, ephemeral category, the event. Even while the legal structure and the media were in the process of de-ephemeralizing the incident, as I said, de-ephemeralizing the incident by producing these archives, they were also attempting to mark it as mundane and everyday and accountable within existing narratives. So the law, the media. So they were like, it was de-ephemeralizing and putting it to archive, but it's also making it mundane in a given narrative structure that we are familiar with. Events then work within this liminal space of everydayness and archivability. To make this absolutely fascinating incident into a researchable event, I would then go on to produce an archive for myself, which included both non-ephemera and ephemera in the sense of objects. This included the material that constituted the legal and the media archive too. If the novel and the film were absolute non-ephemeral objects, gossip, jokes, political speeches made on roadsides, political slogans were ephemeral, obviously. But for the researcher, as the archive is mobilized around the event, this hierarchy doesn't make sense. Even when the formal capacities of these texts vary and demand different approaches, these texts do not allow for such a hierarchy. Without making the joke talk to the novel, the latter does not make sense within the archival matrix that is being imagined. So this hierarchy is a simple one. It's the joke that illuminates the novel in a particular way. So it's not like you can actually have this hierarchy of material. And vice versa. So it's not, again, I'm not saying the joke is more important. It was talking to each other. Here, the event itself was the ephemeral object, which was being contingently and for a period of time being arrested and made non-ephemeral. This is not the anti-archive or the counter-archive. It's rather an optic that renders the archive itself skewed for particular purposes. A book, or what was discussed at one point of time but never materialized, a web archive, of the material that I collected would have changed the status of this archive and by extension the event. This was something that was discussed after the project was done. Can you put together the entire material you had collected as an archive, as a web archive? It didn't happen. If it had happened, the status would have again changed. Right now it exists again, the book has also not happened. So, so it's not yet put together in any formal sense. Don't ask me why. But again, the archive that is produced is one among, as far as I know, three: the media, the legal, and then I worked on it. As far as I know, nobody else has, so there's no fourth archive, as far as I know, but who knows? All this leads to make me suspect that there is no, all this leads to make me suspect the idea that there is nothing outside. What did I write? All this leads to make me suspect the idea that the ephemera is outside the archive. That idea is not something I'm sure. Of course, one is not talking about it in the physical sense. I'm not talking about, again, objects as an optic. It's not outside the archive. The camels, as we saw yesterday, are in the archives. What we do not have is a number. And of course, as it emerged in the discussion after Professor Hebia's presentation, it's not just about camels. As Helena said, it could be guns or people. Like the war horse he mentioned in response to Helena's question, some incidents and individuals are given life in the archive, while others have to evade subjecthood in the archives. One last point about my encounter with ephemera. As I progressed with my research, I decided to include in my dissertation a chapter on an organization of men who claim to be harassed by women. This organization had emerged at the same time as the incident of sexual harassment, without any causal link between the two. To my surprise, this dubious organization had pledged public support to the woman who was protagonist of the archive I was putting together. So this organization of harassed men had supported this harassed woman. So it is a bizarre thing. When I met one of the leaders of the group, himself not a self-identified victim, his first suggestion to me was that the organization is doomed to fail, as in his words, men are cowards. The men who had complaints about the women in their lives were so afraid of them that they would not talk in public. This was his problem. How can one forge a politics based on silence? Strangely, and without letting him know, I was sharing his concern. No, not about being harassed by women, but about the private nature of this apparent articulation. What do I do with it? What is the material? How do I research this thing, right? More ephemera, secrets, hearsay, and so on. Like the problem the law had with gossip, politics was getting a hit, as was my research. And then emerged another archive, which was also a non-archive of sorts. The man I was talking to handed over a box of letters that these men had written to the organization. These were private letters, but written to a public organization. Once again, like gossip, the contents of the letters proved unsatisfactory. The content itself is very boring. It's repetitive. It was rambling, self-evidently problematic, steeped in misogyny, and sometimes crude to the point of being funny. You can just point to the fact that misogyny exists in this world. Beyond that, you cannot do much with that material as a textual, representational kind of thing. Once again, like gossip, the formal properties of the letter seem to be more important than the actual content. It was pointing me to the precarious nature of the male claim to victimhood and the impossibility of a politics founded on such a claim. The form of the letter allowed me to access the negotiations at hand between notions of interiority and the private. Again, I will not go into the actual discussion of that and so on. What do the letters tell me? It once again breaks down the binary between the archive and the ephemeral for me. These letters that straddle the public and the private, somewhere between the novels and films I was working with and the secrets and the gossips, presents for me more of a continuum where the objects and forms in question constantly oscillate between being archival and being ephemeral. The form of the letters allowed me to access another ephemeral aspect of the story, an experience which would have fallen through the cracks. The letters themselves, archived, non-archived, personal, published in books, are only means to get to that experience and the ideological matrix they are embedded in. As I mentioned earlier, the form of the letter foregrounded for me the limits of articulation and the gendered aspects of the public-private bind from a new vantage point, one that refuses, or rather is afraid of the constitution of the public. So there's something about masculinity and private which seem to elude other textual material which I could get to through these letters, the form of the letters, again, not the content of the letters, because the content followed every other available story. But the form itself, that it was written as a private text to an organization, but these are the same men who doesn't want to talk to the media. So there's a negotiation with the public and the private, which is in the kind of liminal, like working out in the liminal space between the public and the private. The fleeting, the ephemeral, then for me, are not about new objects. It's about skewing our viewing practices to contingently reorganize the archive. Helena's discussion today morning of the relationship between the ephemeral and the archival speaks to me in this sense, where she talked about how an ephemeral material talks to the archive, allows to reorganize the archive, and vice versa. That seems to talk to me a lot. Also, Jennifer's and Craig's presentations exemplified that practice for me very clearly, that how that can be done in actual practice. It is about making what would be called textual inessentials take over the narrativizable, which is ideologically structured. So focusing on what are usually understood as textual inessentials to actually take over the narrative. How would you do that as a formal reading category? Moving beyond the anti and the counter, some of these presentations have, for me, provided an elaboration of some of my fleeting thoughts. I was very tempted to say ephemeral thoughts, but I'm not saying it, fleeting thoughts. Ephemera is a recovery of events, emotions, experiences by reorganizing the relationship between objects beyond their hierarchies. Thank you. I wouldn't have time to do this, but I had one small thing about my discovery of a book, which is the first book on cinema from the region I work, in a small library, and this book was never accounted for within the history of that cinema. And to think even about published material as ephemeral, the various things that sit in a library, just because they sit in the library, does it make it archival, or is it something about publishing histories, publishing industry that we can look at as producing more and more ephemera? I mean, that's something else which I had, but I will. Thank you.
I think Namita and Ratish have made my task easier. I was going to say something very ordinary and very obvious, only because it did not get a chance to surface in the proceedings. But they have kind of, provided me with a couple of pointers, so to speak. It was instructive for me to notice how ephemera, as a kind of category, was slipping in and out of reality over the sort of, the discussions we have had. Sometimes it was the thing itself, sometimes it was its image, its representation. I think this is quite, it's symptomatic. It's symptomatic of something that, if I am allowed to be a little ambitious, points to a larger kind of phenomenon of the contemporary reality itself, of the reality of production, or if you like, even capitalism. So it's kind of, that's where even the disciplinary sort of, the question about which discipline, where to draw the line and so on, also would take us, that it's probably a larger reality of production at which we are looking in this kind of process, where the slipping in and out of reality of ephemera itself, not to be able to fix it at a certain register is taking kind of, is taking place. So we have slipped, for example, from the everyday in the first morning, then gradually to everything. This happens because when we cannot probably unproblematically any longer use a certain notion of the representation, which also at some point emerged in the discussion. I think yesterday morning at some point, very interestingly, we cannot probably use notions of representation in a certain way anymore. So that, for example, if you think of a more classical situation where, an older situation where representation as a term can be used in a certain way, used to be used in a certain way, we could probably have this kind of shortcut to a definition of ephemera by saying that whatever falls outside utility, immediate utility, or whatever falls outside the sequence of production of social goods and services and so on, if you just extend that to the reality of production, would be ephemeral in that sense. I mean, it's not immediately sort of, in a larger narrative, you don't see any utility for it. For example, Agamben that Namita mentioned, that essay in Infancy and History on gesture, says that, that the silent cinema had the language of gesture. It kind of continued the language of gesture beyond a certain point of its history, but then it disappeared. He thinks it has completely disappeared. And because, his argument is basically that you have discovered a certain kind of, sequential elaboration of the gesture into narrative, into dialogue, into conversation, when silent cinema gives over to sound cinema. Basically, that's the argument that comes back again and again. I mean, it's a very interesting argument that he has, but basically it repeats the same thing, falling outside, through the cracks of production, falling through the cracks of utility and so on. But the crisis of that notion of representation, where we could hold these two separately, I mean, the thing itself and its image, as I've called it, is the crisis is something that we all know about. I don't have to repeat it. To put it very, very simply, in our terms, terms relevant to this discussion we are having, it's a kind of situation where actually the thing itself, or the object, or reality, if you like to call it, and representation take kind of, they are no longer before and after kind of ordered in that model, that depth kind of model, before and after, foreground, background, reality, representation, dyads and dichotomies. But they are laid side by side. I mean, it's a kind of reality that we inhabit. It's a kind of contemporary that we inhabit. They are kind of more or less, take their place alongside each other. So that there's so much of a semiotic saturation of reality itself. There's so much of a commodity saturation of the environment itself. And of course, there's this collapse of commodities into their own signs. This is the nature of late capitalism, as many people have pointed out. That we cannot work with that notion of representation easily, always. Which is why this kind of serious investment all around in producing the image of everything. I mean, think of surveillance cameras. They serve a certain purpose, but at the same time, turning everything into an image is something that is part of the reality of production, as I'm calling it. If we take, for example, Manan Desai's very interesting presentation, I promised Manan that I'll come back to his paper because I didn't have the time to ask a question, of the South Asian American Digital Archive, SADA. The way they located this remarkable sort of, probably what he called probably the first instance of the evidence of what they called Hindu, everyone they called Hindu at that time, the Indian migrant labor in that video is happening because of a certain, that ephemera is produced through an arrest of a flow. And so that you close up, you draw a line, you circle something with a red line on the image. It's like that. I mean, it's a video that you have sourced from the Internet Archive itself. Then you have arrested something there. I mean, sort of you put that flow into some kind of a stasis, so that this kind of image of the migrant worker, probably the first visual document, then kind of sort of jumps out of it. But how did this happen? This happened, I mean, as he was explaining, of more or less kind of, a kind of practice of a protocol of archives talking to each other. Because these internet databases, the digital platforms are connected with each other. It was not meant to be a video that was kind of, to serve this purpose, but it's because that you can now put a search expression in a search window, and you are taken immediately to these kind of materials in various archives. So that what that material means in one archive, it completely changes when it gets connected and digitally connected to the web, or as it lands up in another kind of place. So this is something, as we all know, is the reality of the informatized labor, what Antonio Negri and his colleagues about 10 years ago called the informatization of labor, because that's how sort of the reality of production looks like now. Somebody's input into the information process becomes somebody's output. Then it kind of feeds into another input and so on. So this has to do with the larger social production itself, which has to turn things into information, virtualize things, and so on. So probably a kind of understanding of economics itself is something that looms on the horizon for us. I mean, disciplinarily, the question talking about discipline, that manner, and this has, interestingly, meant a return, as you have all noticed, must have noticed, the return of, for example, something like phenomenology, which for a while was thought to be a completely dead kind of discipline, and nobody was interested and so on. It has staged a return, in a sense that the experiential side of it, and of course a kind of naturalism in artistic practices, film practices, media practices, the kind of the strong desire to sort of for example, these terms which have become very fashionable in film studies, visual studies, haptic visuality. It's Laura Marx's term. That the haptic nature, the tactile nature, all these, there's a strong desire to invest something that's with a body and with a physicality of sorts. This is definitely a response to what is happening of this completely oversaturated image production that capitalism now entails. And it's interesting that even in my discipline, for example, film studies, Ajay Bazin, Siegfried Krakauer, realists who were completely sort of thrown out of the sort of basically strongly criticized, rejected in the whole process of new film theory, because they thought that these are naive realists who thought cinema could approach reality in a certain way, in an ontological kind of capacity, are staging a return. They're all back. The people are rereading them, people are discussing them, Bazin and Krakauer particularly, because of this kind of what I call return of not really realism, but naturalism of sorts, where actually we have this strong desire to arrest the flow, to provide, to impute a certain kind of physicality to things that are constantly being turned into images, as I've called them. Thank you.
In thinking about what comments I was going to have, I was kind of struck at thinking about it, well, I should bring a hat to wear and try and distinguish myself in some way from the other people who will be speaking. But the question is which hat, since I'm not really sure what disciplines I'm actually a part of. I'm formerly legally trained with paper as a political scientist, but yesterday when Kimberly Huang asked me the question about if I could talk more about the difference between the modern and modernity, and I'm still paralyzed by thinking about, do I approach that from rational choice game theoretic approaches or the more behavioral, sociological, statistical, quantitative analysis? And so I thought, well, set that aside, I'll deal with that later, and actually rather more approach it from my policy side. And most of the conferences I'm going to these days, and in fact, Friday, through bad planning on my part, I was at a China and energy policy conference. And one of the things that strikes me about it, that conference, as opposed to this one, and why I like this one so much more, is that policy conferences always tend to end up with several things at the very end. There's two phrases that I did not hear anybody say, which I am going to say because I think maybe we do need to think about them. One is takeaways. So what are the takeaways? And the other one is next steps. What are the next steps? Because policy people, a policy conference is a different conceptualization of a workshop and a conference, because it is the idea at the very end of it you will come up with a conclusion, and then therefore everything that was actually discussed is ephemeral. Throw it away. They actually keep a record. We'll record it, and you can go on the website and see what it is. But it's not the idea that the conference itself and the ideas that are discussed is itself going to be a living thing, that it will continue beyond. And so that's one of the things I enjoy about this conference. But however, thinking about what are some of the things we could do going forward, it did actually come out, I think, in many of the presentations and the discussions and the panels. What are some things we could kind of think about? The one, I think, that came to mind in listening to other people and then also in the panels is this roundtable, this panel discussion is supposed to talk about ephemera and disciplines. And it came into, I think a lot of people brought up the idea of disciplines as ephemera. People were talking about gay and lesbian studies, women's studies, subaltern studies, and aspects of them as being, I think, ephemeral. But we also were thinking about this at Rice University because we're coming up to our 100th anniversary. And people are going back and looking to see why Rice was founded, what are the ideas amongst that. And one of the fun things is to go back and look at the first president of Rice, Edgar Odell Lovett, and his talk about how Rice has had to learn a lot from most advanced studies all around the world. He himself did a one-year tour going around parts of Asia, but mainly Europe. German universities figured very prominently in his studies, and to learn what were the most advanced disciplines and studies that we should bring back. One of them, he concluded, was eugenics. And so I'm thinking myself about how we can come up with a bring back eugenics thing as a nice discussion over the next year as part of our centennial public awareness campaign. But it raises a question, I'm thinking about this conference, that obviously there are people who do study eugenics and the study of eugenics, and there are materials, of course. But what I'm wondering now is that are there actually studies of the archiving of eugenics? You know, are there the memoirs of the librarians and the people who were asked to do this? That would be something I think that we could talk about maybe in future conferences and workshops. So, you know, past the disciplines or thinking of future ones as well. Also, I'm always just naturally inclined to, when you're in such a spectacular setting like this, I'm always reminded of Stanislav Lem's book about the Futurological Association, the World Futurological Association, of this grand absurdity of scholars coming together into thinking about what would be future disciplines might look like and what materials we might need to start saving to perhaps help them along. Also, as well, thinking about ephemera and archives, I think in the practice side, we also talked about, I think, pedagogy. And one of the things that came up in many of the presentations is that ephemera were motivated by pedagogy, and how can I better can convey to students. But we didn't really talk about so much about the idea about how do we actually train students to make archives. So that would actually be, I think, be fairly interesting to do. I was also thinking that it might also be useful then to use a medium, a form of social media that students are fairly familiar with, which allows for this fairly easily, at least digital ephemera, text and visual images, and that's Tumblr. And it might be interesting to have some type of group Tumblr, or with teacher and students, or perhaps us together. And that would be, I think, fairly interesting to do, to try and set up a project. And so that might be, focusing more explicitly on pedagogy might be something in future ones as well. Also, so many of the discussions involve the idea of the expert versus the layperson in these as well. And we didn't really get to talk about the idea of public versus scholars and public versus private. We did public and private did come out, I think, in a lot of the discussions. But actually getting the public to think more about ephemera. And maybe this is just coming to this conference and then talking to even colleagues, but also family, and saying, oh yeah, I'm at a conference on ephemera. Excuse me? What is that? The fact that ephemera seems to have no contemporary political social relevance beyond scholars. And so it might be interesting for us to think about, is it possible to create some type of collective archives or archiving project? And one public policy debate that's going on very recently talks about that question, and I think it came out in one of the presentations this morning, talking about video games and how video games using genetics and things like that are being experimented with. And one of the things was very recently there was a breakthrough where a company that for years had been trying to study some genetic codes and trying to break down the particular sequencing of them. They've been trying for 6 or 7 years, weren't able to do so. They said, well, let's turn it into a game, and put it out there on the internet. And some 12-year-old kid cracked it, literally by screwing around with it and following different paths. And so it's raised some questions at the National Science Foundation and other places that rather than investing in elite institutions and research laboratories and working on collaborations amongst the so-called elite institutions, maybe we should be turning over more of our analysis to the public. And so training publics and creating micro labs, community labs and things. So it'd be interesting for us to think about if there's something like a community lab, or community toolkits and things like that, taking that out more into publics. And so those are some of the things I was thinking about that might be next steps and also takeaways from this. Thank you.
This is the point at which I wish we had an afternoon session. I found the discussions this morning utterly fascinating, and the presentations, the summary discussions of this current panel, really marvelous. Unfortunately, it's my responsibility to formally end our workshop and to thank you all very, very much. I will do something else that's very traditional and address the question of what I think has been at stake in our general discussions. And many people have contributed to the emergent sense of what is at stake. One has been, I think, the notion of interest, and this was something that Betty raised early on when she spoke about the interested archive. And I gave a great deal of thought to that. I myself do not subscribe so heavily to the problem of archiving, and I'm more interested in the problem of defining ephemera. But I was very much taken by her insistence that that we do these things in part because of interest. Something is at stake for us when we do this, and an interested archive is not the same thing as a state archive or a formal archive or a corporate archive, and so on and so on. This also came up in the issue of preservation and aesthetic/intellectual play, which both Namita and Craig brought up at various different times. And that is very much at stake for me. A third thing is, a second thing, is the tension between economic and political value. And this is something that was implicit, I think, in many of the discussions, and which Moynihan has brought to a head, and has sort of saturated this particular day as people mulled over the question of monetary value, or the weight to which the ephemeral is measured against saleability. And finally, I think very much at stake for many of us is this issue of representation and its place in the vocabulary. And I'd like, in the critical vocabulary of a generative analysis and speculative or generalizing arguments, also known as theory in other worlds. It occurred to me over these last days that what has been displaced in this initial workshop is actually the paradigm introduced by the theoretization of the Subaltern Studies project, which rested on a dilemma of representation and the cracks or catachristic nature of deconstruction understood as a process. It seems to me that the tension between archive and ephemera simply substitutes another possible way of looking at historical understanding, one which does not need to tiptoe around the processes of production, also known as capitalism, or the development of advanced capital, commercial capital, and so on, is in fact tightly drawn to that because the two terms in play are both processes and, as several people have pointed out, also can be understood materially. Consequently, it's my great sadness and my great pleasure to thank you all very, very much for giving so much to these discussions in such a stimulating way. Thank you so much.